Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel, and today is finally the day. We are going to be installing the Top Gun's Ace Supercharger kit on my 370. This is something that I have been looking forward to doing for years now, ever since Stillen released their Supercharger kit for the 370Z and G37s over 10 years ago. This is something that I've really wanted to do, is to be able to boost one of these cars, and today I'm finally going to be able to make that dream a reality. In this video, I'm going to be giving you guys a complete DIY on how to install this Top Gun's Ace kit on the 370Z. It should be a fairly simple process. I've already looked through all the instructions. It's going to take roughly 8 to 12 hours depending on skill level. It'll take a little bit longer for me just because I'm filming everything, but I've already got all of the parts organized and laid out in roughly the order that we're going to be installing them on the car, just to make this whole install process go smoothly. If you guys are new to the channel and haven't seen the previous videos in this series, take a look at some of the previous videos that I have done on installing the fuel return system, as well as like the fuel pumps and the injectors and all the supporting mods that you need for this kit. It gives some good information there on the supporting mods, how to install them and that sort of thing. But without further ado, let's get to the install, because we do have quite a lot of ground to cover here as the length of this video suggests. The first thing we need to do is we need to jack the car up into the air. We're going to remove the front wheels, as well as the fender liner, the front bumper, the engine cover, the strut bar, as well as the factory intakes. Now, I've already shown you guys how to do this in some of my previous videos, so to save some time here, I'm going to fast forward. I'm going to be leaving, again, links up here in the top right corner to videos that explain how to do each of these steps. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. Alright, so we've got our front bumper off, as well as the factory intakes, the engine cover, the bracing. Again, look at those links that I shared in the top right corner to be able to understand how to get to this point. From here on out, we'll go through the detailed instructions on installing that supercharger. So first things first, we're going to remove these two little plastic pieces on either side that used to connect to the factory intakes. These will not be connecting to the new charge piping. Instead, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be placing a filter on the ends of these. So we're going to go ahead and just remove these parts out of the car now. So you'll undo a 10mm bolt here, as well as the hose clamp. And for this side, we've just got that single hose clamp over here. So with those two plastic bits of the PCV system removed, now what we'll want to do is remove this radiator cover here on the top. So you'll just undo a bunch of plastic tabs. Now with that plastic radiator cover removed, we need to take off the aluminum brace on the front of the car. Now this is something that you guys need to be aware of if you're going to be buying Aaron's kit, as well as a lot of other forced induction kits that use a large intercooler. There's not enough space for the intercooler to fit behind this, so you need to remove it. This does hurt the structural integrity of the car just a little bit for front end crashes, but you can actually buy an aftermarket part from Fast Intention, which I believe is supposed to be able to fit in front of the intercooler that we're going to be installing today. I might also look into possibly modifying this to fit it as well. But just understand that, again, front end crashes, you will be losing some structural integrity here by removing this brace, but there are some aftermarket parts that may be able to help you remedy that. So we're going to go ahead and remove the bolts that are sitting in here, as well as on the passenger side. I believe these are 12mm. So with that plastic tab on the front of the bumper removed, the next thing we need to do is go in here, and we're going to need to cut out this plastic tab that holds the wiring loom onto the back of the headlight. This is going to obstruct the new piping that we're going to have to run. So we're going to have to get a Dremel tool out, pop out that tab for the wire, zip tie it off to the side, and then Dremel off that little tab so that way we can make the additional room that we need. So to me, that tab looks pretty much removed now, so we should be good to go and have enough clearance. The next thing we need to do is we need to adjust this relay box. We're essentially going to remove this piece from the car and then shrink wrap the relay that's in there. This is just to give additional clearance for the supercharger housing, as well as the piping that we're going to be running. So what we want to do is go ahead and remove both the top and the bottom covers. And then we need to remove the actual relay as well as this dummy socket from this box. So in order to release these, it might be difficult to see there on camera, but there's a little tab on one side of the relay as well as an additional socket. If you go in there with a flathead, you should be able to kind of push that tab out of the way, and then you can push the relay through. And now we've just got the harness separate from the relay box. So with the relay as well as this empty socket removed, we're gonna take this piece of heat shrinkable capping. We're gonna place it over the part that has the relay, tuck it in there as deep as possible. We're gonna heat shrink this part, and then we're gonna electrical tape the bottom as well as electrical tape this little socket here to prevent moisture from being able to get into these. So with the electrical tape over that open plug as well as the bottom of the cap here, this should be pretty well sealed off from weather. So now we just kind of want to tuck this out of the way. So I'm going to kind of just set it off over to the side here. Probably zip tie this plug over as well. That way it's just out of the way when we go to install the supercharger in this space. I'd also recommend you go ahead and just remove this bracket that used to hold the relay box on. It'll give you a little bit more clearance when we go to install the charge pipe later. So with that space cleared out over there, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to relocate our reservoir for our coolant. We're going to be installing a new reservoir, as you can see over there, and we're going to need to take this one out. Now before we begin taking off hoses and things here, you want to make sure your engine's cooled down. Mine's still a little bit hot from driving it this morning, so now might be a good chance to take a break, go get a beer, get lunch, whatever it is you need to do. Just wait until it is cooled down before you start taking this out so you're not spilling hot coolant everywhere. Alright, so the engine is relatively cool now, and I even popped the radiator cap off just to make sure that there was no pressure buildup. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and remove the hoses that are attached to the reservoir itself. Don't take the hose out completely, we're just going to remove it for now from the reservoir. So we'll start with this hose over here. So it's going to be the one on the far right. You should be able to just undo this hose clamp with a set of needle nose pliers and then pull that off. We'll go ahead and pull that out. And for now, I'm just going to kind of tuck this out of the way. And then we're also going to remove the overflow line over here. This line essentially acts as a way to bleed off excess coolant down to the ground if it ends up overfilling somehow. So we're going to go ahead and just pop that hose off, fairly simple. Tuck that down and out of the way. We'll be removing this hose a little bit later, but we're just going to leave that for now. Then we're going to undo the two 10mm bolts on either side that holds this reservoir to the radiator core support. So what I've gone ahead and done is taken that line that's attached to the radiator neck and I've tied it up as high as I can get it. That way when we begin to pull the reservoir up, it won't drain a ton of coolant off to the side. You can see where I actually ended up losing a little bit of coolant over here because I was trying to tuck the hose away. But yeah, this should kind of help prevent that from happening. So what I'll do is I'll pull that reservoir up and then I'm going to put it over this bucket here to catch all the coolant because there's one additional line on the bottom that we'll have to remove. So we'll undo the hose clamp there. That'll allow us to catch all of the coolant and then we can dispose of it later. And then we can remove the reservoir from the car. So now I've got both of these coolant lines tied up to prevent the coolant from leaking out. The next thing we'll want to do is we'll want to remove the overflow line down here. So there's a couple of clips that hold this on. We want to remove this OEM line, and then what we're going to do is we're going to attach it over to the new reservoir tank, which is then itself going to be sitting in this location over here and out of the way so that we have enough room for our charge pipe. So this is what the new reservoir that's provided with Top Gun's kit should look like once you've got all the hoses attached. We've got the OEM overflow hose here, which we went and removed from the radiator core. So that's been attached back to the top, and we're going to route this to flow to the bottom of the car in case we ever have an issue with too much coolant being inside the reservoir itself. We've got this shorter 2-foot hose here, which I've gone and tightened down the hose clamp for already. This is going to replace the original hose that was attached to the radiator filler neck, so we're going to actually remove this. And then that hose is going to attach there. And then we've got this longer hose, it's like 3 feet or so, I think it's like 55 inches, something like that. This barb fitting looks like it's going to connect to the original hose here. And so we're basically just going to route it through the front of the engine. So yeah, we're going to put the reservoir tank roughly in the area that it needs to go. I'm not going to bolt it down yet because we're going to go and run all the wires first, and then we'll secure it with the bolts that are provided with the kit. So So I want to show you guys how I have the hoses routed for my reservoir. Now I don't have it quite secured yet. One thing though, when you do buy this kit, there will be different routing depending on if you have a pressurized system from the 2012 and earlier models or if you have the 2013 and up. So this will be the hose setup for the 2013 and up models. So here's the overflow line which we took off the car. I've got it sitting in that top clip now. Once I've got the reservoir completely secured, I might trim off a bit of this hose or might see if I can route it all the way down to that second clip down there. For the top hose, I've currently got that routed over and around this wiring harness over here and then coming back up. And then that attaches to the radiator filler neck. So just kind of another look at the hosing there. You want to make sure it doesn't kink, that's the important part. And then for that longer hose with the barb fitting, I've got it coming underneath these radiator hoses, basically going along the top of the radiator core support. And now this is important. You got to try and route this as far down as possible to leave room for the supercharger itself. So that kind of comes up over here. And we need to attach this fitting to this section of hose. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to trim this hose so it's just long enough to be able to reach over and attach to the barb fitting here. Now what I went ahead and did before I trimmed the hose is I went and drained more of the coolant so that I could actually hold it low enough to where the point is that I'll be cutting. So I've kind of drained some of the coolant you can see down there. So now as I said, I'll trim this hose up, attach it to the barb fitting, and then I'll secure the hose clamps both for the radiator filler neck as well as for this connection here. Alright, so now we've got the new reservoir tightened down. We've got it attached there with that bolt. You want to attach it using the upper rung there because there's going to be two holes in this bracket. Attach it with the top one so that way it sits as low in the engine bay as possible. We've got all of our lines now properly secured, running to both that filler neck as well as attached. I used two hose clamps here on this fitting because this one made me a bit nervous. So I went ahead and just attached it with two. And as I said, just make sure that this routes as low in this area as possible to make enough room for the supercharger. And then that overflow line, I was able to bring it through and attach it all the way to the bottom rung as well, running underneath this main radiator hose. Now that that's done, we'll go ahead and top off the reservoir with as much coolant as we can actually fit in here. Obviously, because the engine's not running, there's going to be some air still left in the engine from all that coolant that I drained earlier. But we're just going to fill it up as much as possible, and then once we can get the engine actually running later, we'll go ahead and burp all the radiator hoses and then we'll be able to fill this up a little bit more. But yeah, so go ahead and top off the reservoir. So the next thing we need to do is we need to relocate this cooler for the power steering. The reason for this is because the intercooler is going to be sitting right in front of this and the oil cooler. So we need to push this back, so we're essentially just going to be flipping the brackets around. So what we need to do is we actually need to undo our lines here to be able to drain the power steering fluid. So that's the first thing we're going to do. Just get a container to kind of catch it all. So that's the power steering fluid pretty well drained at this point. What we need to do now is need to remove the hard lines from the system. We're going to be replacing these with new hoses that are going to route through this section of the radiator core support. So we're going to go ahead and take these tubes off. I'm going to undo this bracket right here, as well as pull off this little plastic plate, and then I should be able to show you where those hard lines connect a little bit easier. Alright, so as you guys should have seen from that fast forward, I already removed the bracket and that little plastic cover plate that covers over this little section of the frame. And I've also removed that section of the hard line that attaches to the hose that leads up to the power steering reservoir. Both of those have been removed already. I'm going to go ahead and remove this hard line now. With that plastic piece removed, you can actually pull this section of the hose forward, undo this clamp, and then that will free up this other portion of the hard line. And then we're also going to remove that hose that was attached to the hard line that leads up to that reservoir. We'll detach this as well, and then we're going to replace them with two new hoses, which are going to go in place there, and then reroute through this section of the plastic, but we'll get to that in a second. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take those two new power steering fluid hoses. The one with the barb fitting is going to attach to that soft line, and then the one that's open on both ends is going to attach way back up to the power steering fluid reservoir. So we've got those two new lines in place here. The next thing we need to do is we need to unbolt the power steering fluid cooler. We're gonna need to flip these brackets around to recess the cooler back a little bit further so it's more in line with the oil cooler. And then we're also gonna slide it down one place so that way it's not butting up against this. And then we're gonna have to drill holes in this as well to be able to make room to clear these new lines that we need to put in place. All right, so we've got the cooler flipped around now. Obviously, we just turned these brackets around 180 degrees, and there's little bolts on here that you undo to be able to separate these brackets so you can flip them. Because there's not a mounting location, sort of like these, over on this side, you need to take one of these clips out and then basically just drill a hole through the bottom of this radiator support. That way you can throw the bolt in. So now that we've got that secured, the next thing we need to do is we need to cut through some of the plastic over here so we can run those new lines over to the cooler. Now, because my plastic is really messed up from the crash that I had recently, I'm not really sure that I can just drill a 1-inch hole here because this plastic is pretty crushed. So I'm just gonna kind of cut out this sort of section of it using a Dremel, pull this out, and then I'll run my lines through there. Additionally, there's a section of the plastic that you should have to cut out from this side. I'll show a photo of it now. But again, because I've lost all the plastic here, that's pretty much already done for me. But yeah, so you'll essentially just need to work the plastic so that you can run your new lines in behind the intercooler. Alright, so I've got the oil cooler lines attached now. Again, you can just drill like a couple of 1-inch holes here with a hole saw. And that way you don't have to cut out as much material, but because most of my core support on this end over here is missing, it really wasn't helping anything, so I went ahead and just cut that out. The top side of that cooler is supposed to attach to the bottom side of the pump where that soft line was. And then that bottom of the cooler there attaches all the way up to the reservoir. Now for the reservoir itself, I'm going to go ahead and fill the level to a little bit past the max line, and then later once the car is running we can shimmy the steering wheel a little bit to try and work out some of the bubbles and then get this line in between the max and min. With that topped off, the next thing we're going to do is bend this tab out of the way. The supercharger is going to be sitting in this area and we need to make a little more clearance. So we're just going to grab onto this with a pair of pliers and then bend it up. That way it's still there in case for whatever reason I need to go back to naturally aspirated. And then the other thing we need to do is we need to take a set of pliers to this hard line and we want to move it so that the hard line as well as this rubber hose are clear of the belt. So when we go to install the new belt later, we'll be able to route it through this area. So yep, go ahead and get started on that. Once you've bent the tab for the factory airbox out of the way, I'd also recommend you cut out or bend away this tab that supports the wiring harness leading to the headlight location. This will just give you a little bit more clearance for the intake plumbing when we begin to install it. Now this next step, at least for me, was the most difficult of the entire install process. As I previously said, we have to bend this coolant line out of the way to be able to make room for the new serpentine belt. If you're doing this with the engine in the car, as most of us will probably be doing, it's just a really tight space in here and there's not a lot of room to get tools down. You're supposed to be able to use a set of pliers or even a hammer to kind of tap that coolant line out of the way. But even doing this, I just found that progress was really slow and had spent about an hour trying to work this line back. But what I found worked best for me was going to the passenger side on the back side and then being able to pull the coolant line towards you using the claw of a hammer. Alright guys, so bending that water cooler line down there out of the way was a real pain in the butt. So this thing originally sat above the belt, as I told you guys earlier. I spent a good probably hour just kind of tapping on this thing with a hammer, trying to pull it around. Eventually what I found though, I think my best strategy really, if I can find the hammer here, was taking this thing and going in from back on this side and then prying that line towards you. That way it just kind of gets out of the way of the belt here. And then this hose that originally attached here, you had to shorten this by about an inch. I took almost an inch off of both sides just to keep it from kinking. But I finally got that in place now. It's not sitting in the way of the belt anymore, so that's all clear. So now the next thing we need to do is we're going to need to take the tension off of the belt so that we can remove it. Alright, so unfortunately the camera died on me, but let me kind of show you guys how this is going to work. So that right there that is the belt tensioner. Currently I've got an Allen wrench sticking in these two loops to keep this locked, but this is what actually puts tension on your belt. Now in order to get that to budge, in order to be able to loosen the tension, you'll need something like this. It's a 3/8 drive breaker bar. I had to go and pick one of these up because I only had a 1/2 inch. And that is going to slide, get under the car. That is going to be inserted on the 3/8 inch rectangle. There's a little slot up here on the belt tensioner. Let's see if I can get the camera to focus. There's a little 3/8 inch slot right there on the belt tensioner that you need to insert that breaker bar into. And then you can actually release the tension. It's easiest to get to this from the bottom of the car and then have somebody up top help you insert that Allen wrench. So now with all that tension loose, we should be able to pull the belt off of the pulleys, and then we're going to remove that from the car.
I'm running out of time, every day goes by so fast. And every moment counts, baby, I don't want to miss a thing.
So the next thing we want to do is we want to remove this idler pulley right here. There's a 14mm bolt on the end of it. We'll need to take that off and then remove this idler pulley, and it's going to be installed on our supercharger later. So the next thing we need to do is we need to unclip this wiring harness, which is attached to the dipstick tube in a couple of locations. So unclip it, and then we need to tuck it behind the dipstick tube to make room for the brace that's going to hold the supercharger. You can unbolt the dipstick tube here as well to make this a little bit easier. Personally, I didn't find any need to unbolt this. You just undo the harness here, and then you can slide the wiring harness in this gap between the crankcase and the dipstick tube, and then just reconnect that little connector there. So the next thing we need to do is we need to undo a couple of bolts to be able to make room for the new idler pulley that we're going to be installing. If the camera will focus, there we go. So in order to do that, there's a bolt right down here underneath this little neck here for the radiator. We need to undo that one. This bolt right here, oh, you can see that. There's one down there, and then there's another one right here. We need to undo all three of those to be able to make room for that new pulley. Alright guys, we are almost ready to put the supercharger in the car. There's a couple of more things we need to do first. So starting off, the belt is not currently installed. This is because the belts were hard to find. Because of COVID-19 and everything, unfortunately, it was difficult to find these. So the supercharger was shipped to me without the belt on. So in order to get the belt on, the easiest thing to do would be to go ahead and take off the tensioner pulley. So all you have to do is unthread the little bolt here that sits on the top, or the nut rather, and then we can slide that pulley off, and then that will get it out of the way so that we can work on trying to slip the belt onto these two pulleys here. Alright, so getting this belt on has been a bit of a process. The technique that I've been told works best for this is to try and get the belt, all of the ribs, onto one side of the pulley, stretch it with both your hands as far as you can over to the other side, and then begin to roll the pulleys along to try and get those ribs to catch and pull the rest of the belt back onto the pulleys. I've gotten almost all the ribs on now. There's still like 2 or 3 of them left here. It's not completely on yet. What I'm going to try and do is see if I can press down on the belt to get the additional ribs to catch. Keep rolling it. Let's see if I can use some more force here. And the belt seems to be making its way on. Yeah, so basically, if you don't have all the ribs on, if you can kind of see how it's been working here, you push down on the belt and then try and roll the rest of the ribs back on to the belt like this. There we go, perfect. So now we've got the belt completely on. Now, if you can see right there, the belt's pretty loose. This is going to be prone to slippage. So in order to fix that, we need to reinstall the tensioner pulley. So we're going to put that back on. We've got a spacer and a nut to go on top. And then what we need to do is we need to essentially thread this little piece back here, so there's an adjusting knob on the back here. We're going to use this to force the pulley into the belt to be able to get it tensed up. So once I've got it set correctly, I'm going to show you guys the setting that I have according to Aaron, who produces the kit. So here's a look at what that tension setting should look like. The top of those threads should be almost in line with the bracket here. This is kind of what it looks like once it's been tightened. As I said, you take a 3/4 inch crescent wrench to this to be able to tighten that down. And so there we go. If you order this from Top Guns, it should already come with the belt installed with the pulley tensioned, but because the belts were hard to find because of COVID, I've had to put it on myself. The last thing I want to do on the back side here is just go ahead and make sure that all your bolts are tightened. I need to go and retighten mine because I temporarily took the bracket off to take a couple of photos, but we'll go back, tighten each of these bolts, and then we should be good here. So now for this side of the turbocharger and the bracket, we need to remove this idler pulley because it blocks one of the mounting bolts that we're going to need to install to be able to put this on the crankcase. So we'll take a 3/4 inch socket and we'll go ahead and pop this pulley off. So now we're going to go ahead and install this bracket onto the back of our brace. There's 2 bolt holes here at the top of the bracket. And then if you look on the side, you'll see 2 threads that are on that angled piece here. These need to go onto the back of the bracket. So the next thing we need to do is we need to remove this cap on top of the supercharger. This cap covers the drain port for all of the oil that's already installed inside the supercharger itself. And then you should have been provided with a stainless steel line. This line is basically to allow you to route the oil line further down the car so that you can access it from the bottom. That way you can drain the oil out. If you don't install this, then essentially anytime you want to do an oil change, you'll basically have to take out the entire supercharger. So you'll need to do an oil change, by the way, after the first 2,500 miles to break the supercharger in. After that, I believe oil change is supposed to be every 7,500 miles. So yeah, this takes a 9/16 socket, so we'll go ahead and pop that off. Make sure that this is pointed up, by the way, so you don't drain all of your oil out. So with that stainless steel line in place and plugged into the bottom of the supercharger, you want to turn it upside down and make sure that you're not actually bleeding any oil through. And then on the top of the supercharger, we are going to need to remove this plug here with the smaller Allen wrench head on it because we're going to replace it with this little breather plug. This is to make sure that you don't have a ton of pressure buildup inside the supercharger. And then we are going to undo this side here, so this should be the dipstick. We'll want to check to make sure now with the supercharger upright that our oil level is at the correct location. So let's go ahead and get that plug out first and install the new breather plug. Alright, so now I'm going to check my oil level. These Vortech V3 superchargers are supposed to be shipped with oil already in them, but it's a good thing to check to make sure that the oil is still in there. And after adding that stainless steel line, we want to make sure that our oil level is still correct. So we're going to take the dipstick out. For that, we're just using a fairly large Allen wrench. Let me see if I can find the markings on here. It looks to be a 5/16 Allen wrench. And we're going to just pop that loose. So I'm going to go ahead and wipe down this dipstick, and then I'm going to insert it back into the supercharger. Make sure that the supercharger itself is fairly level. I'm going to lightly thread the dipstick back in and then pull it back out. And we should see some oil registering on the dipstick itself. So I don't think this is going to pick up on camera because the dipstick is so small, so I don't know that it's going to be able to focus on it. But I do actually have oil sitting here on the end of the dipstick. There's little hash marks on there that kind of tell you if there's oil in there or not. So because my oil line is sitting on those hash marks, it looks like we're good to go. I'm going to go ahead and tighten the dipstick back into the supercharger. And we are literally moments away from getting the supercharger installed. There's one last thing we need to do. So we need to remove 5 bolts from the crankcase. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 5. And then we also want to remove these 2 grounding wires up top. These 5 bolts, by the way, on the crankcase as well as the 2 grounding ones up here, we're not going to be reusing because we're going to be replacing them with brand new hardware. Alright, so now it is time to drop the supercharger into the engine bay. So we're going to have all new hardware here. We've got replacement bolts. The little brace up top is going to be sitting where those two grounding cables used to be, and then those grounding cables are going to be bolted on top of this little brace. And then we've got the 5 bolt holes along the side here. This is going to also be using that new hardware, and those are going to be installed in place on the crankcase. Guys, this is a moment that I've been waiting for over 10 years. When the 370Z first came out, like, I really wanted that car. I didn't even have a driver's license yet, but I looked at this car and said I really wanted it. And I found out that there were supercharger kits also coming out for it. So I had big dreams of one day being able to install one of these things in my car. I never thought it would actually happen, but it is happening now. So let me go ahead and get the supercharger put in the engine bay and let's see how it looks. So one thing I noticed, this clip that holds the wiring harness for the MAF sensor was getting in the way. So I'm going to go ahead and see if I can remove it out of the bracket. For this, I'd recommend just unclipping the wiring harnesses from this metal bracket and removing the bracket completely. This is going to need to be done later anyways to be able to make a little bit more clearance for the supercharger pulleys. Alright, so let's try that again. Alright, so the next thing on my list of clearance issues was this hard line down here, so I've gone and tried to push that a little bit further down into the engine bay. Hopefully this won't be butting up against the spool now. And then I've also gone and zip tied the little coolant line that we put in place back to this hard line over here. Hopefully that will keep it away from the supercharger now and won't be butted up against it. So let's try this one more time. Alright, so it seems there's one more thing that I forgot to do. We need to remove these plastic air ducts that were part of the factory intake system. We need to remove the one on this side to be able to fit the new filter. And we also need to remove the one from this side so we can fit the new charge piping that's going to be going through here. So in order to remove these, I believe we just need to pinch on that little tab there that sits right in the middle between those two bolts to be able to free it. And then we just need to tug on them back through the engine to pull them out. And it seems on the passenger side there is also a little wiring harness attached to it. So we'll undo that wiring harness and yeah, hopefully we can get those ducts out. So I just removed the driver's side air duct here off camera. Pinching on this little connector here is not enough. There was also a 10mm bolt that I didn't realize was attached to it. So once you undo that 10mm bolt, it's pretty easy to just kind of pull this thing out through the engine bay. So now we should be able to install the supercharger. All right, let's try it again. Alright, so I've got all of the bolts loosely in place here, and it finally looks like we are pretty much good to go on clearance. I'm going to go back and try and reposition these wires later and kind of zip tie them off to the side so they're not touching the pulley. But everything looks good to go now, so we're going to go ahead and tighten all the bolts down so that we can get the supercharger completely secured in place. Alright, and all of the bolts are now tightly secured so the supercharger is in place. So what we need to do now is we need to go and install these two idler pulleys that we had to take off so that way we could get to the bolts. So we've got both of the bolts as well as their spacers here. So we're going to go ahead and install those idler pulleys. So the one that we removed further down there is going to be going up top, and then we'll replace that one idler pulley that we removed earlier down here. So with the supercharger in place now, let's go ahead and get the filter on. So this is the turbo guard that comes with Aaron's supercharger kit, and he also provided one of these little pre-filters. I ordered a couple of additional ones to be able to drive around with on a daily basis, but for now I'm just going to be running with this one filter. So we should be able to squeeze this in here, get it onto the supercharger itself, and then we can tighten down the hose clamp. And with our filter on, let's go ahead and work on getting our new serpentine belt in place. So I'm going to show on screen now what the new belt routing is supposed to look like. I'm going to start off by feeding it up through the bottom near where the tensioner is, because it needs to run over the tensioner, and the presence of that arm kind of makes it a little bit difficult to be able to wrap the belt around. So I'm going to feed it up from the tensioner area first, and then I'll start working the belt over the rest of the pulleys. Alright, so I've gone ahead and applied tension back to the belt, so we took the Allen wrench out, and now the belt is completely taut at this point. You want to make sure before you do that your belt is sitting perfectly centered over each of the pulleys. You don't want one of the ribs to be hanging off the side of the pulley, for instance, before the car starts. If it is, it'll probably center itself, but really you just want to make sure that all of your pulley is centered before you go ahead and let the tension off. So with that all set, there's one thing that I forgot to show you guys. I'll go back down here. So if y'all can see there, that is the oil drain line for the supercharger. I've got it just kind of sitting inside this clip for some wiring loom that isn't there. And you might be able to see it, but it goes all the way back up to the top where the supercharger is. I've basically got it routed on the inside of this radiator hose, and again, I'm sorry for the camera work, but it's pretty cramped under here. But yeah, so this is just how I'm routing my oil line for the moment. If that oil line were to somehow come loose of that little clip, it's not in danger of running into any moving parts, and it would just fall down to the undershroud, so there's really no risk of this getting damaged. But yeah, that's just how I'm routing my oil line for that supercharger. Alright guys, so now we're going to remove the little plastic duct that's still in here. So in order to take this off, again, we're going to have just this 10mm bolt, that little clip right there. And then also we have this little wiring loom, and then once all that's off, we should be able to slide this back out through the car. Alright, so now we need to try and make enough room in this duct to be able to fit this shorter hose, because it's not going to fit through there on its own. So we're going to need to kind of make a mark here on some of this material, and then get the Dremel out and start working at it until we can actually slide this through. Alright, so with that hole finally drilled out, everything else should be relatively easy to do. I mean, we still have a lot to do in terms of routing all these pipes, but it should be fairly straightforward. So the first thing we're going to do is grab our intercooler. We're going to bring it on over, and then we're going to get it mounted on here loosely to start with, so that way we can wiggle it around a little bit with all the intake pipes and things, just to make sure that we get it set correctly. So we're looking at the back of the intercooler now. The way you know it's the back is it'll have that blow-off valve, which should be pointed towards the radiator when we finally install it. Here are the supplied bolts. They've labeled them IC bolts here. So what we're going to do is we're going to mount these brackets on the side. So notice how I've got them set right now. They should be going kind of up and away so that they don't interfere with either of the inlets for the intake piping. And then we want that bend, if we're looking at the back, we want that bend to be upwards like that. So let me go ahead and get these two brackets mounted, and then we can start putting it on the car. So one problem I was running into when trying to get the intercooler to fit here, so you've got this little plate which originally just kind of stuck down towards the road. I've had to basically just press my palm against it and bend it back so it gets out of the way of the intercooler. And then I've taken those two sockets that were attached to it and went ahead and just zip tied them up to this bar right here. So this should give enough clearance for the intercooler now. I've gone ahead and loosely attached the brackets onto the car instead, and then I'm going to try and put the intercooler up against these. So the intercooler is now on, again, pretty loose because I'm not going to tighten these down yet. We want to make sure that it's loose so we get enough wiggle room for when we go to put the couplers on. Now we're going to begin putting in the pipes leading up to the throttle body, starting with the driver's side. So the driver's side has this very special shape on it, if you can kind of see there. It's got this sort of cobra head shape, and that's needed because the space on this side is very tight in between the intercooler, the fender liner, and everything else. We're going to try and get that piece on first. We're going to be using a 2.75 inch to 3 inch coupler for this. And we've got the hose clamps over there as well. It's really important to note that on the sides of the hose clamps you'll have numbers, which kind of specifies what size they are. When you get these, I would just recommend sort of sorting them out. That way you know which ones are the larger ones, the medium-sized ones, and then you get the smaller ones for the 2.75 inch fitting. So, alright, let's go ahead and see if we can get this guy installed on the driver's side. Alright, so it took a good 5 to 10 minutes of wiggling this around, but I finally got it in place. That little cobra head shape in the pipe down there really makes this thing work, and it's just so tight in terms of space. But I finally got it in place. My recommendation for you guys, put the 2.75 inch side of this coupler on first, and then sort of push the 3-inch side down into it as well. So these are now lined up, and you don't have to have the hose clamps on there to begin with, because these things do separate. And then you can just sort of thread the bolts on later. So I'm gonna go ahead and install those hose clamps, and then we'll do the passenger side, which should be a lot easier. Now would be a good time to go ahead and reinstall the MAF sensors as well. So now we're going to install this section, which connects the passenger side intake for the throttle body to the intercooler. So I've got a 2.5 to 2.5 coupler, and up here it's a 2.5 to 3-inch coupler. So we'll see if we can wiggle this in place. And then here is the driver's side piping as well. Only difference for this side is you're going to be using a 2.5 to 2.5 inch coupler up here, because the end of this cobra head is a 2.5 inch instead of a 3-inch like on the passenger side. So yeah, I've gotten those tightened down. For this side as well, you're going to need to trim up some of that plastic to be able to get this pipe to fit. Once again, my section of plastic here has broken off, so I didn't really need to do that. But yeah, so now we've got this pipe installed. The instructions for Top Gun's kit says that the next thing we would do is begin working on installing this piece of piping. However, before we begin installing that, I feel like it's going to be more convenient to go ahead and start working on our blow-off valve. So let's go ahead and start getting this prepared for installation. Alright, so I want to go ahead and start assembling our blow-off valve. Now the whole point of the blow-off valve is to be able to release the boost pressure whenever the throttle bodies are closed. The reason for this is we don't want to damage the supercharger, we don't want to damage the bearings and anything else just due to overpressurization, because when those valves close, the air is going to have nowhere to go, but the supercharger is going to keep trying to force air through the line due to the engine RPM, so we need to be able to blow off that additional pressure, hence the blow-off valve. So with blow-off valves, if you're installing it on a turbocharger, you typically need to open it up and adjust the spring rate depending on what your vacuum level is inside the manifold. However, because it's a supercharger and because the pressure, the boost being generated by it is essentially governed by the RPMs of the engine, you basically want to set your vacuum level to be fairly high. I believe the spring rate as standard on these precision turbo blow-off valves is -5 psi. So we're going to leave it at that. We're not going to add any of the additional spacers to try and adjust that pressure level. We're just going to leave it as is. So what we need to go ahead and do is install the banjo assembly. So we've got the single banjo fitting here with the barb on the end of it. We'll take out the banjo bolt as well as a couple of these washers, and we're going to go ahead and install it on the end of our blow-off valve here. Alright, so we've got that banjo fitting now tightly secured. We're going to go ahead and slip on the blow-off valve hose that was provided with the Top Gun's kit. We're going to slide a hose clamp over the top of this, and then we want to secure this hose clamp fitting. So we've got this boost reference line attached to our blow-off valve, and we've got it really nice and tightly secured with that hose clamp. The last thing we need to do is remove this little flange right here. So this is meant for if you want to weld the blow-off valve onto a piece of piping. However, because we already have a blow-off valve mounting location on the back of the intercooler, we're simply going to remove this and then attach to that connection point. So we'll go ahead and unthread the little clamp here so that we can remove this flange. So we've got our blow-off valve tightly secured to the intercooler, and we've got that boost reference line running over here and passing through the air duct. When we install that section of charge pipe here, this is just going to get pushed off to the bottom right. And then that boost reference line continues down through the engine bay. And then I've got it coming up over here. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be tapping into this section of wire right here that leads over to the throttle body. This is going to be our boost reference line. It's basically attached directly to the manifold. So we're going to install a little T-fitting that was provided with the kit, as well as a couple of hose clamps to make sure that everything is secure. So with that BOV line now attached to that T-fitting, we're going to go ahead and install the short pipe here. So we're going to insert this through that little cutout that we made, sliding the blow-off valve line off to the corner. And then we're going to take one of our 90-degree silicone fittings and see if we can maneuver this onto here. So for this short pipe, I actually found it was easier to put the 90-degree joint on the back first. I've already secured it with a hose clamp, you can see here. And then I went ahead and slid this short pipe back through the front, and I've got it secured with the hose clamp on this side as well, and got it secured to the intercooler. So the last thing that we need to install, the last piece of piping, is going to be, if I can find it, it's going to be this main hot charge pipe that's going to run from the blower all the way over to that 90-degree joint. The only thing sitting in the way right now is this tab, so we actually have to trim this out, so we use a Dremel tool to take this out. So we've got that last coupler on. This is the orientation you want your hose clamps, by the way, so it doesn't butt up to the pulley and also allows the hood to close. If you have your screws pointed up, then the hood simply just won't close because there won't be enough clearance. So I'd probably recommend you also try shutting your hood just to make sure that everything is fitting and that nothing is going to be protruding up too high. Alright, so now that we've got that last coupler in place, all of our plumbing is now set. We're going to go ahead and tighten down our intercooler. So with the intercooler secured, we could go ahead and install the breather filters for the PCV system. However, unfortunately, no adapters for this were currently provided. Originally there was a set of plastic ones that were used, but they would crack. So I've got a barb reducer ordered right now so that we can adapt it to that PCV line. So instead, what we're going to go ahead and do, since we've got pretty much everything installed in the car, we're going to work on getting all of the fender liners placed back on the vehicle, install the bumper and everything else, get the car back down on the ground. So with the car back on the ground and the wheels torqued down, we need to go ahead and change out our map sensor. So the original sensor was only good between about -10 and 0 psi because that's typically what the pressure in the manifold would run without the supercharger. But now we need to install the speed density sensor, which is going to replace it. This sensor will allow us to be able to detect pressures above the original factory values. So essentially we just need to undo the socket, undo the 10mm bolt, pull this out, and then we'll replace it with the new sensor that'll come with the EcuTech software when you buy the tuning package from Top Guns. Now ideally the next thing we would do is install the engine cover. However, that front portion of the engine cover won't fit anymore due to the brace here for the supercharger. So I'm going to leave it off for now until I get a chance to modify that so it'll fit. Instead, we're going to go ahead and install the brace, the strut tower brace, back onto the car. Now, it doesn't actually clear either side of the intakes. It's going to be butting up against it. So to get around this, you're given some spacers here, which are going to go on the bolt holes on either side for the strut towers. That way, it'll lift it up a little bit and hopefully be able to clear the intake tubes. So a couple of important things now that the install has been completed for a couple of weeks now. First off, the engine cover is installed. I did cut away a little section of the bottom here to be able to make it fit with the supercharger in place. The PCV filters have been installed on the hosing now. So for these, I ended up just using a 3/8 to 5/8 brass barb reducer fitting. So that's how I managed to get these installed on there. As I said, originally Aaron provided a set of barb fittings for these kits, but he's currently doing some R&D to try and get some new fittings in place there. Also, a couple of important points to make as well. You really have to watch out for the clearance, especially on this driver's side between the piping and the supercharger. Originally I had maybe a couple hairs width of space in here. I've had to take the plumbing out and redo it, so now that I've got more like a pinky's worth of room. You can see where the supercharger corner had been butting up against the plumbing and it started wearing some of that paint away. It's really important when you're installing this to make sure that it's got plenty of clearance. Even if it seems like you've got enough, just know that when the engine revs, the entire engine itself is going to rock on the engine mounts, and the supercharger is going to go with it because it's directly attached. So it might end up butting up against the plumbing. So you just need to keep an eye out for that. Just make sure you have this piece of intake plumbing set so that you have plenty of clearance. Both with the supercharger as well as down here. This is that section of frame down there. It's really hard to see, but originally I said you guys should probably bend it out of the way. I ended up cutting a bit of it away just to kind of give a little more clearance on that side. And then the other thing you got to watch out for is the intake plumbing kind of butting up against the strut bar here. In order to give you the best clearance for this section, I highly recommend pushing this piece of intake plumbing all the way up against the throttle bodies, just to give it as much clearance as possible with the strut bar, as well as with the bit of frame down here for the car. And the spacers that Aaron provided, I found weren't really sufficient. I ended up adding a couple of additional washers just to give a little more clearance between the strut bar and the intake plumbing so that it's not butting up against it. Another section you want to watch out for is going to be over here. This little hose clamp ended up eating away a bit of the intake plumbing on this side, so I ended up just moving it so it's not touching it now. So yeah, just watch out for your clearance, guys. You want to make sure you don't end up poking a hole into any of your piping here. I also found that the wires and hosing on this back side would get really close to this pulley, and in some cases would even kind of rub up against it. So one thing you want to do for this wiring harness over here, this is originally in front of the oil filler cap. I ended up kind of pulling this behind it since it's no longer attached to the bracket, and then I'm able to zip tie the rest of these wires and things over to it, and that gives plenty of clearance there between the pulley and those wires and hoses so that there's no risk of them rubbing. And yeah, that's all there is to it. This install really wasn't that difficult, fairly simple in fact. It's not something I'd recommend for first timers if you haven't worked on a car before, but I had a more difficult time in the past installing long tube headers or doing my clutch. This was fairly simple, all things considered. The hardest thing was trying to bend that coolant line out of the way. I did spend a good hour on that. For me, it took about 12 to 14 hours just because I was having to film everything for you guys. But if you've worked on cars before, it's going to easily get knocked down in about 8 to 12 hours. Not that difficult at all. And that's it for this video, guys. No need for a lengthy outro. This video has gone long enough. I'm going to thank you guys for watching, and stay tuned. In the next video, we are going to see the first startup of the 370Z. Stay tuned. I'm just kidding, guys. The car is already flashed. Let's get this thing started.